Boldwood presents Vendetta, written by Edie Baylis and read by Annie Aldington. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Prologue, 19th of January, 1996. Dan Marlowe didn't hide his wish to catch the barman's eye through the hatch specifically placed for shouting orders. It always paid to appear chilled out and not too intent on the job in hand. It might make him look a prize mug not having his eye on the ball, and although most people might have an aversion to making out they weren't the brightest spark, Dan did not. Doing it this way was what pulled the cash in. "Another pint, please," he shouted in the direction of the miserable stocky man serving the punters in the main room. Putting away plenty of drinks was always noted too. It lulled people into a false sense of security, allowing them to assume he was half cut. Dan inwardly grinned. He'd got this down to a T, but in all fairness, he'd have been happy to give this particular sit-down tonight a miss. He and Mickey had done okay for themselves around the London pubs this month, so he'd have preferred not to push his luck. For the third time, they'd cleaned up with bells on at the Joiners' Arms, and their reputation in Clapham was now sailing too close to the wind to be comfortable. Hence, they'd had to venture further afield. Not so far afield, mind. Streatham, to be precise, but far enough away from Clapham to slow the speed of the grapevine. South London might be a big area, but nevertheless, it was important to take this one slow so as not to arouse suspicion. He glanced at the intent faces around the separate room at the back of the Bricklayers' Arms. There was a shed load of money up for grabs tonight, which was why Mickey had insisted they come. Personally, Dan would have preferred to wait a while longer, but what he thought rarely counted. Dan nodded his thanks as his fresh pint was placed on the hatch, ignoring that the sullen barman sloshed 2 inches of his beer onto the stained wooden shelf. This would be the last drink anyhow. Chucking his cigarette end on the floor, Dan ground it out with his heel. He'd pulled in a couple of small wins tonight, making sure to lose more than he'd won until the last minute, as previously agreed. Everything was going to plan. Now, seeing Mickey's barely imperceptible blink to signify the off, he waited for the cards to be dealt. The odds had raised to a level where it was all or nothing, so it was a good job Dan knew he would clear up. Mickey was so good with his sleight of hand, so bloody expert. Even knowing what would happen, Dan was yet to physically see it. The man was a genius, an absolute fucking genius. Dan covertly scanned the huge pile of notes in the centre of the scuffed table. There was only him and one other player left, an old bloke sweating so much he looked a prize candidate for a coronary. Knowing all eyes were on him, Dan mirrored the old man's flash of worry on his face as he glanced at his cards. He never paid to look confident, and he didn't much like the look of several of the people here who had already been forced to fold. Dan concentrated on the one remaining player and sat tight as Mickey worked his magic, dealing from the bottom of the pack. The opponent picked up his cards, his slight flinch giving Dan all the information he needed to know. The guy was fucked. He slapped his cards face down on the table and scooped up the pile of money. "Think this is mine?" Dan grinned, standing up. "Cheers, fella. That's me done for tonight." He'd contain his glee for just a while longer until he met up with Mickey at the prearranged spot down the road. All he had to do now was leave, which shouldn't be difficult. Mickey gathered the cards up. "Another game, anyone?" A squat man with a long scar down the left-hand side of his face pushed himself away from the wall and snatched the remains of the deck out of Mickey's hand. "Let's just check these." Dan froze. What the fuck was this? He glanced at Mickey, who appeared outwardly unruffled. The man spread the cards on the table. "I've heard about you two from the Pig and Blanket," he snarled. "Yep, look, just as I thought. This wanker has been dealing from the bottom." As the other men's faces twisted with rage, Mickey upended the table as a diversion. There had always been a get-out plan in the event of this happening. They'd never needed it before, but they sure as hell needed it now. Seeing Mickey already exiting out of the small back room in the confusion, Dan started towards the door. Slipping on the loose cards scattered on the floor, he lurched forwards, and as a meaty hand closed around the back of his neck, dragging him back into the room, he could do little about it. Shit. Dan's mind raced. "Wait, it's not what you think. What about the other one?" someone yelled. The heavy-set man with his hand around Dan's neck cast him to the beer-drenched floor. "I don't give a toss about him. This fucker's the one with our money." Dan grinned, even though there was a boot across the front of his neck holding him still. "No hard feelings, boys." By pretending none of this was happening, he remained calm as his pockets were rifled through, relieving him of his winnings. "You've got your money back now, so no harm done." The squat man leant over Dan's prone form and snarled, revealing a gap at the front of his selection of stained teeth. "That's what you think, cunt. You've pushed your luck one time too often around these parts. We don't like cheats. I'll make sure neither of you play anywhere around here again." Dan's eyes widened as the man pulled a meat cleaver from his inside pocket. "Shit, shit, shit. Let's not be hasty. You've got your money back now, so Hold the fucker still," the man snarled to the others in the room. Dan struggled pointlessly, the grip on his arms and legs too strong. Seeing the meat cleaver rise, his eyes bulged. The last thing he lucidly recalled before the raging pain kicked in was watching with a strange, detached fascination as the fingers on his right hand were effortlessly removed. Chapter 1. 1 week later. Marina Devlin glared at Dan downing another can of lager. She'd broached this subject several times, but he'd refused to discuss it. He'd refused to discuss anything this past week, and she was sick to the back teeth of it. How she wished she'd walked away from Dan when she'd had the chance, rather than trying to prove the choice she'd made 2 years ago had been the right one. She'd really liked Dan at first, really liked him, so she'd gone against everyone's advice to steer well clear of him, including that of her brother, who had told her time and time again that Dan was a loser, only out for himself. Marina stubbed a cigarette out and scowled. Yeah, how she wished she'd listened to Grant. Dan was a loser, and not just a loser, but a loser with a gambling problem, as well as a self-inflated sense of his own ability. Since this belated realisation, it had been one thing after another, each episode worse than the last, leaving her further trapped. Because if she walked away now, she'd have to admit that she'd been wrong. And she wasn't doing that. Dan's latest idea of becoming involved with Mickey Devlin, Marina's good-for-nothing father, was the last straw. And now this. Marina's eyes tracked to the grubby bandages on Dan's hand, and she shuddered. Getting his fingers cut off. How could he have allowed that to happen? For God's sake, Grant was right. Dan was a useless, deluded bastard, and all that had kept her going this past year was scheming how she could get rid of him, and not just out of her life, but out of life in general. It was all she could think about. Grabbing her cigarettes, Marina sparked up another. She might as well smoke herself to death. Why couldn't Dan have got himself killed rather than just losing his fingers? At least it would save having to arrange it herself. Plus, as a broken-hearted girlfriend left without means, she'd be eligible for decent benefits. That was about all she'd got going for her these days. So much for London being paved with gold. Whoever coined that saying needed their head read. "Are you doing breakfast?" Dan muttered, ash dropping from the end of his cigarette onto his bare chest. "Shit!" he yelped, brushing it off with his good hand. "Unless you fancy relieving me of my frustration." He wrapped his arm around Marina's waist, his morning erection pushing eagerly against the small of her back. "I'd best get up. Time's getting on." Marina edged out of Dan's grasp. Being around him made her skin crawl. How she hated him. Getting out of bed, she pulled her dressing gown around her nakedness and tugged her long blonde hair from the neck of the robe. She hadn't slept a wink again last night and was still tossing and turning when dawn broke this morning. She was shattered. She had to do something about this situation. Marina watched Dan fumbling to open another can of beer with one hand, sick of putting up with his pathetic excuses. "What are we going to do?" "It will be okay. You'll see." Dan inwardly grimaced. Every bloody day she went on about this. He glared at the remains of his hand. Exactly what the fuck was he supposed to do? He couldn't even work in bastard McDonald's like this. Not that he had any intention of working anywhere like that. It was all very well Mickey saying things would be easier once his hand had fully healed. It was all right for him. It wasn't like he'd lost half of his fingers, was it? The final insult was not only was being with Marina like shagging a corpse these days, but she turned into a nagging witch, which pissed him off. Everything pissed him off, but not quite as much as what he'd learnt last night. Mickey might have escaped unscathed from those loons in the bricklayer's arms, but the man was right about one thing. Now other disgruntled participants from their previous poker games were queuing up to recoup their losses. He stood to lose a hell of a lot more than just his fingers. Dan glared back at the shorter version of his hand. At least Mickey had come up with a viable workaround. Marina wouldn't like it, but that was tough. Dan? Marina repeated. Did you hear me? I said, what are we going... I heard what you said, Dan snapped. How could he not? Her droning on was driving him bloody mad, so he might as well just tell her the news. We have to leave. Marina frowned. Leave? What do you mean? Leave where? Dan waved his arm around the bedroom. Here, this place, this town. He gritted his teeth. This whole bloody city. What are you talking about? Marina screeched. For Christ's sake! Unless you've forgotten we've got no money, so where would we go? She paced around the room. It can't happen. Dan's face screwed into a scowl. It has to happen. Marina stopped pacing and glared at Dan. Or what? You'll leave? That was the next best thing to him being dead. Go on then, leave. I've had enough. Off you go. Fine, I will. But I don't advise that you stay. You'll end up losing those good looks of yours, Dan snapped. I'll spell it out for you. It's simple. There are people after my fucking head. He dragged the fingers of his good hand through his knotted hair. I discovered the extent of it last night, and it's worse than I thought. We need to go. We've got no choice. Marina blinked. Lose her looks? She wasn't losing her looks for anyone. They were all she had left. Dan reached for Marina's hand, shrugging as she batted him away. Look, I know I've caused problems, but this is important. If I'm not here, they'll come for you. You don't know what these people are like. I dread to think what they'd do to a stunner like you, purely to spite me. Was it finally sinking into her bloody head? They'll have even more reason to hurt you when they find out you're Mickey Devlin's daughter. Marina swallowed uncomfortably. Was Dan serious? She might have known her father would make things worse. Dan was usually the eternal optimist, another example of his delusions. But this... Your dad said he'd lend us money, Dan continued. And I want nothing from him. Do you hear me? Nothing! Marina screamed. Nor do I want anything off you. Oh, come on. It's not all bad. Think about it. See it as a fresh start. There'll be new opportunities up there and... Marina's heart thumped painfully. Where? Up where? Birmingham. Mickey says we can stay with your mother. My mother? Maria screamed. No way. You know I won't do that. That woman, she's... Listen, you stupid cow. Did you not hear me? People are coming for payback and I'm a sitting duck. We are sitting ducks. Jesus Christ, Marina spluttered. What the fuck have you done? How she hated him. She thought things were bad 10 minutes ago, but now things had surpassed even a useless hand. What have I done? It's more like... Dan stopped as a plate smashed over his head, and Marina started screaming every single obscenity she knew. I didn't expect to hear from you. Grant Devlin eyed his father suspiciously. He'd worked out a long time ago their father was only out for himself, as was their bloody mother. Why else would he and Marina have ended up in care? It had taken Grant a long time to find a place in the world and discover something he could do well. Yet the last time he'd been stupid enough to allow Marina to talk him into visiting their mother, he'd vowed never to put himself in a position again where the selfish old bitch could make him feel as worthless as he'd felt that day. As it was, it had taken years to override the inferiority complex he'd had as a child, and he didn't need reminding of the time he'd felt lower than a dog's dick, because neither of their parents wanted them. To be honest, Grant had very little recollection, if any, of the day they'd been taken away. He and Marina were only dots when they'd been put into care, but he did remember the occasions when both he and his sister got excited about the impending visits from their mother. Grant clenched his jaw. He'd even convinced himself she would take them home so they could be a proper family. That way, they'd no longer have to put up with the endless digs from the other kids at school, calling them the ones no one wanted. His brow knitted. Despite the constant letdowns, he'd clung on to that bizarre hope for years. He'd been stupid, and it must have been a full 5 years of their mother failing to turn up for one single visit before he finally accepted she was a cunt. Thankfully, once he'd come to this realisation, it became easier to plough on with life, and by 28, he'd done all right. Having been surrounded by violence and ne'er-do-well since he could remember, it had been second nature to consider that a viable job prospect, and with a bit of brains, luck and damn hard work, he'd excelled in various jobs for dubious firms over the years. So much so that he now worked for himself as a freelancer, a gun for hire, accountable to no one and free to make his own choices. He even put up with occasionally talking to his so-called father, but the man showing up unexpectedly at his local pub meant only one thing: trouble. Grant's eyes moved back to the man busy slurping the pint he'd felt obliged to stump up for. "So, what is it you want?" Mickey flashed his son a knowing smile. "What have you got on at the moment, work-wise?" Grant pursed his lips. It was true he was between contracts at the moment, but he didn't imagine this man was about to offer work. Nothing he'd be interested in anyway. "I thought you might like to know what I found out about your mother," Mickey said, a sneer rolling onto his face. Grant's eyes narrowed. "Why the fuck would I want to know that?" Leaning on the sticky pub table, Mickey lowered his voice. "Because you might wish to investigate it. From what I can tell, there'll be a hefty payout in it for you." "I've told you before, I'm not doing your dirty work. I might be for hire, but I don't do freebies," Grant snarled. "I'm not asking you to." Mickey plastered his face with fake hurt. "It's some easy money, and being as your sister's heading up that way soon." Grant almost knocked his own pint over. "Marina's going to see our mother? What's that about?" "Nothing to do with me. It was something Dan mentioned," Mickey lied. Grant folded his arms across his muscular chest. "I am not seeing Linda Matthews again," he said, the words hissing like steam through his gritted teeth. "Why the hell would Marina want to visit that old bitch? Hadn't she learnt through experience the old cow wasn't interested?" That last time Marina had tracked their mother down 4 years ago was etched into his brain. Raddled with gear, the woman was in a right state. She hadn't even bothered hiding her crack habit. Neither had she hidden that she blamed them for the mess her life was in. Actually, it had been a case of blaming them along with anyone else she could pull out of the hat. The list was endless. OK, their father had undoubtedly not helped by leaving her in the lurch, but it had been her who'd continued getting off her head once the social got involved, and not fighting to keep hold of her children. Mickey laughed. "You don't like your mother very much, do you? At least you can appreciate why I fucked her off." Grant stood up. Just being in this man's company irritated him. "If Marina wants to go to visit that bitch, that's her call, but I want nothing to do with it." Mickey pulled a newspaper cutting from his pocket. "You may change your mind when you see this. I spotted it when I went up Brum a few months back." Grant snatched the clipping from Mickey's hand and unfolded it. He hardly recognised his mother. This woman looked almost normal, but it was her without a doubt. Posh dress or not, those were her eyes, the same eyes as those of this woman. His eyes moved to the beauty standing to the side of Linda. It was a black and white photograph, but he imagined the young woman's dark hair to be the same rich shade of deep brown his mother's had once been. The sketchy memory of his mother's hair from his childhood was nothing like the greasy grey-streaked mess he'd last seen 4 years ago. His eyes crawled back to the photo. His mother's hair didn't look greasy anymore. Was it possible she'd cleaned her act up? Unlikely, but then, how come she looked so together, so normal in this picture? And why would she be at that place if she was still a crack-addled whore? The Violet Orchid Casino, Birmingham. The signage on the wall in the photograph clanged like cymbals in Grant's mind, grating like the ultimate hangover. Samantha Reynold, recently reunited with her biological mother, Linda Matthews, enjoys a night out at her casino, the Violet Orchid, along with Sebastian Stoker and a family friend. Who the bloody hell was Samantha Reynold? A sister? One that he'd never even heard of? Grant's teeth dug into his lip, the pain failing to detract from his seething anger. So, he and Marina had gone into care, whilst another sister lived the high life, a life granting her the ownership of a fucking casino. Somewhere that, by the looks of it, his mother was now also enjoying. Why should she have that? His brow furrowed further. So that was where Linda was, living it up. This daughter was clearly one child Linda had wanted, or wanted now. No surprises there. Again, typical attitude of Linda. Because that's who she was to Grant, Linda, not mother. He slugged down his pint, his rage growing. Why should that skanky old bitch benefit? For once in his life, Grant accepted that Mickey was right. He was interested in this, very interested. As much as his father was a Class 1 prick, he might be onto something. Mickey watched Grant's expression closely. "What do you think?" Grant was just about to respond when the pub door burst open and one of the regulars rushed straight over. "It's your sister. She's asking for you," the man panted. "What's happened?" The man shrugged. "Dunno. Something to do with her and the boyfriend?" Grant yanked his leather jacket from the chair and shoved the newspaper cutting in his jeans. He looked at Mickey. "Are you coming?" "Nah. She's your sister. I don't want to interfere." Mickey nodded to the pocket containing the clipping. "Let me know what your plans are, and make sure you keep me updated. Don't forget who gave you the heads up. I'll be expecting my cut." Ignoring his father, Grant rushed from the pub in the direction of Marina and Dan's flat. Marina was the only person in this godforsaken world that he cared about, and if that wanker Dan had done anything to upset her, he'd rip the loser's head clean off. He'd also speak to her about what he'd just learnt. Marina hated Linda Matthews as much as he did, and if this wasn't the reason she was planning to visit the old cow, then it soon would be. Chapter 2. Samantha Reynold pulled several sheets from the pile of packing paper and made quick work of carefully wrapping a plate. Laying it in the box on top of the others she wrapped, she glanced at Seb. His back to her. He made light work of stacking a heavy box of books on top of more boxes. "I'm not sure why we're doing this," she said. "It could be weeks before the house completes. You know how drawn out these things can be." She looked around the open-plan living area of her Symphony Court apartment in dismay. Boxes now took up the majority of the space, leaving only an alleyway to walk through, and the general clutter and disarray was getting on her nerves. Seb saw the frustration on Sam's face. Although they had muddled along for the last few months, alternating between staying at Sam's apartment and his above the Royal Peacock, they both wanted their own home, but very soon the place they both loved would be theirs. "It won't be too much longer. I'll put the thumb screws on and see if I can hurry it along." "That would be good." Sam's feelings for Seb Stoker had not diminished in any way since the first time she'd set eyes on him. Their unexpected whirlwind romance had survived the unsurmountable odds of being rivals in both the casinos and firms. But since the very public truce offered by Seb's father, at least the long-standing rivalries could no longer be used by anyone as bargaining chips against them. She stared at the diamond and amethyst engagement ring on her finger. She never got bored of looking at it, the same way she never got bored of looking at Seb. And she never would. His touch, his voice, everything about him fueled her drive for life, like the air around her. Her world might have been turned upside down over the last year in ways that she'd never believed she could survive, yet alone be happy about. But now she couldn't be happier. "Have you heard from Gloria?" Seb asked. "About how the kids are getting on?" "I popped in last week to check on them, but I'm keeping a low profile. It's better for them that way, but they seem to have settled in well," Sam said. Allowing her newly discovered younger half-brother and sister time to adjust to living with a stranger and settle into a new school was the best thing all round. It also allowed them time to digest what had or hadn't occurred with their mother. Turning away, Sam closed her eyes. The disappearance of her own biological mother, Linda Matthews, was the fly in the ointment in an otherwise great new life. Making amends with Gloria, the woman Sam had always believed to be her mother, whilst trying to build a relationship with Linda, her real mother, as well as the crushing blow of discovering her own cousin had been behind the attacks on her casino and firm, was bad enough to deal with. But then what happened with Liam? Sam shook the thoughts away, but failed. What she'd done to the man she'd counted as a friend, and what he'd done to warrant it, she'd struggled with. Had it not been for Seb, she didn't like to think how she might have coped. Linda disappearing had been the crux. Now, having drawn a blank in locating the woman, Sam had no choice but to completely accept, or to be more correct, almost completely accept, Linda had betrayed her too, although it had been difficult. Her real mother had made a choice not to be found, and there was little Sam could do about it. Yet there was still a tiny part which hoped she was wrong. The longer time went on, the more unlikely that was. Guilt nagged. About those kids, about Linda, about everything. Even contact with Vera, her mother's old friend, had trailed off. It was like Vera blamed her for keeping the door open for Linda, should the opportunity ever arise. Seb watched Sam as he continued moving boxes. What he'd do for the power to take away the worries that plagued her. But whatever happened, he'd be by her side every step of the way. Putting down the box, he wrapped his arms around her. "You're thinking about him again, aren't you?" He brushed a tendril of her hair from her face. "You had no choice, Sam. You had to do what you did." Sam nodded, her eyes downcast. "Maybe, but Liam was going to rape you. He almost did." Seb stopped his voice from turning into a roar. Every time he thought of that bastard, it fired his veins with hatred. It should have been him who had finished Liam Taylor. "He betrayed the business, as well as you, and he most likely would have ended up killing you." He tilted Sam's face up. "I would have done it if you hadn't. I should have. And no one will ever know what happened. You know that." Sam nodded. Seb and his brothers had covered her back, and nothing would lead to her, but that wasn't the point. The whole thing ate away at her. Seb was hard as nails. He was used to that kind of stuff, but she wasn't. She pressed her face against his chest, like the crisp clean scent of his shirt could somehow cleanse her mind. The night she'd killed Liam, she'd made a vow that she would not allow anything like that to happen again, to anyone, and she'd sworn she would do whatever was required to achieve that. There were too many men using physical strength, or their emotional hold over women to abuse them, or, like her own mother had experienced, push them into a place where they could be abused by many. Sam wanted to rid the world of those kind of people, and it had since become her mission, the thing to focus on and keep her brain from imploding. She was well aware she couldn't remove all of those bastards entirely, but she could use her clout and position in the city to clean some of the streets around here of this filth, and Seb had promised to help in every way to do just that. But she was also acutely aware that Liam haunted Seb a lot more than he let on. Every time Liam came into their conversation, even if Seb controlled his words, by the way his jaw tightened and the flash of fire behind his eyes, she knew it ate away at him. That he hadn't been the one to snuff Liam from the world would always be a thorn in his side. Sam swallowed, fear rising once again. She'd felt soiled and sullied from Liam's violation, and had spent some time terrified Seb wouldn't or couldn't love her the same way. Every time he reacted with this suppressed hatred, it brought that raw fear rushing back. She couldn't bear any of this without Seb loving her. As important as it was to deal with things in her own way, it was also equally important not to forget Seb's own demons. But she wanted to move on in ways that didn't involve looking over her shoulder for when their luck ran out. Her future was with this man, here. As much as her power afforded, she would stop what had happened to Linda from happening to as many young girls as possible. Only then would she want to bring a child into this world. And she'd love nothing more than to have Seb's baby, as part of cementing the next stage in their relationship. Seeing Seb studying her, concern mixed with anger in his green eyes, Sam smiled. She jerked her head towards the messy room. "Come on, let's get on with this." Because that's all she could do. Get on with things. And forever be grateful this man loved her as much as she loved him. Dan dragged his hand over his unshaven face as he ushered Grant into the flat's poky lounge. "Where is she?" Grant barked. "What have you done?" Dan sighed. "I haven't done anything. Marina just went batshit and attacked me with a bunch of fucking plates. Been bloody hysterical, she has. And all she kept saying was that she wanted you. I'm sure she's going mad." Grant glanced through to the kitchen, seeing a pile of smashed crockery on the floor. Not that it made much difference to the overall look of this place. The dump was a hole of the highest command, and certainly nothing like Marina's previous flat that she spent a lot of time making nice before this tosser arrived on the scene. Moving to an armchair, Dan handed Grant a can of warm lager. "What you done there?" Grant asked suspiciously, scrutinising Dan's thickly bandaged hand. Dan pointlessly tried to conceal his damaged hand down the side of the armchair. "Oh, I had a bit of a run-in with, With who?" Grant interrupted, his eyes narrowing. "Who did you piss off this time?" Just a small problem at a poker game," Dan blathered, coming to the conclusion there was little point trying to hide it. "I, got me fingers chopped off." Grant spat a mouthful of tepid lager over the garish carpet. "Your fingers?" And who was he doing these carblags with, as if he couldn't guess? "I see Mickey came through this unscathed." His rage built. Mickey hadn't mentioned a word about this just now in the pub. His father never got the hag, just left a trail of it in his wake. "Mickey had the nous to leave quicker than me." Dan shrugged, unsure why he was making excuses for the man. "For fuck's sake," Grant barked. "How could you let this happen?" "I didn't actually let it happen," Dan gabbled, slurping at his can of lager. He needed way more beer, but he didn't dare venture out in case one of the many people after his ill-gotten gains pitched up. He looked warily back to Grant. "But it means there's people on me back, so I need to lie low for a while until this bother blows over." Grant looked at Dan, the penny dropping. "Hold on. By any chance, is this why you're going to Birmingham?" Dan grinned sheepishly, hoping he wouldn't get a clump. He had enough problems without Grant Devlin bashing him up. "Well, when Mickey suggested we stay with your ma for a while, I thought it was a good idea." Standing up, Grant paced the room. That sly old cunt. Mickey was sending Dan and Marina to Brum in the hope that he'd follow to do his bidding, but that didn't change the most important thing. He swung around, wanting to smash his beer can into Dan's face. "So what you're telling me is that you've put my sister at risk. If people are coming for you, then they'll be coming for her too. I never thought it would turn out like this. I'm sure everything will be fine once we're out of here. Up north I can put things right and start again," Dan spluttered, ever optimistic. Marina dragging things out wasn't helping. Dan needed to leave, and every hour was wasting time. If he had any sense, he'd have buggered off already. But Marina had a bit of money left on her credit cards, which he could use. Plus, he didn't like cooking, so she'd be required until he could afford nightly curries. There was also the small issue that if anything happened to Marina, Grant would rip his head off. It hadn't been his plan to get people on his back. He'd been doing okay. It was Mickey who'd insisted on going to that last game. If they'd backed off for a while, like he'd suggested, then things would have been fine, he was sure of it. Dan looked pleadingly at Grant. "We really do need to leave, mate. I don't want anything to happen to Marina because of me." Actually, he didn't much care, but it sounded better. Grant shook his head. Dan was a prize bell-end, as much use as a chocolate fireguard, a useless prick, and he rued the day his sister ever got involved with the moron. Removing Dan would be the only time he'd consider doing his job for free. "I'm going to see Marina." Without waiting for a reply, Grant walked down the hallway into the bedroom, finding his sister curled into a ball on the bed. "Rena? It's Grant." Perching on the edge, he reached out to stroke her hair. "Oh, Grant!" Sitting up, Marina fell against Grant's chest, because that's what he'd expect her to do. And she had to do what was expected. Lying here, waiting for him to arrive, like she knew he would, had given her adequate time to think of a new course of action. OK, given the circumstances, it was the only course of action, but this time it would be to her advantage. Playing to Grant's protectiveness of her, she knew he'd kill Dan for causing her grief, which would save her the hassle. Dan would not be a problem for much longer, and getting away from where everybody knew them meant there would be the opportunity, but she needed her brother to help her achieve that. Marina kept her face pressed against Grant's shirt so he couldn't see her dry eyes. "We've got to leave. Dan said that if we don't, then people will come for me." Grant's eyes narrowed. "Nothing will happen to you, I promise. Leave, Dan. I'll protect you." "But I can't," Marina wailed, hiding her smile. She was reeling him in. "I won't abandon Dan. He needs me and I love him." The words almost choked her, but she had to keep the illusion going a little while longer. "We're going to Birmingham." "I heard." Marina buried her face deeper in Grant's chest. "Come on, Grant. Do what I want like you usually do." "I don't think I can face doing this on my own." "You don't have to," Grant said, pulling the newspaper cutting from his pocket. "Take a look at this. I'm coming with you, and we're going to get some well-deserved payout." And Mickey could forget it if he thought he'd see a penny. Frowning, Marina looked at the cutting, remembering to sniff occasionally for effect. Wait, what was this? A sister? And a rich one at that? Our mother is now living it up. Am I seeing this correctly? Grant nodded. Looks like it, doesn't it? Whilst you're safely hidden from Dan's shitty exploits, I'll make it my business to get a payout from our mother's recent change of circumstances. And as much as it pains me, I'll put up with Dan too, but only for your sake. The one person he would never let down was his sister. Marina gave Grant one of her practised grateful smiles. If only she'd known this 5 minutes ago, she wouldn't have given him all that welly about loving Dan and not abandoning him. Dan could have stayed here to get murdered, while she went with Grant to get the money. The very least their tramp of a mother owed them. Bollocks. But it was okay. She'd think of something. When are we leaving? I've told you before to scrub it off, Tom Bedworth roared, his nicotine-stained fingers pinching the girl's face as he dragged wet toilet paper across her delicate skin. Scrubbing harder, he applied more pressure, his eyes gleaming, knowing the cheap, scratchy paper would hurt. He served the silly little bitch right for not following instructions. He'd teach her. You shouldn't bite the hand that feeds you. Deb Banner stemmed the brimming tears and clenched her teeth. There was little point explaining she'd only put makeup on to hide the bruise across her cheekbone from that punter last night. It was Amelia's idea. OK, she hadn't had to put eyeliner and mascara on too, but it was too tempting not to. He made her feel better. Makeup always did. But now it had backfired. Deb's bottom lip wobbled. To make things worse, Chaz would be even more annoyed with her now. He was already going off her. She knew he was. He'd been so attentive at first, and all over her. But these past few months, he'd changed. Now she barely saw him, and when she did, he spoke to her like dirt. It was breaking her heart. Chaz had assured her that they had a future together, that they just needed extra money to make a life for themselves, hence her working here. But Deb was now wondering whether his change in attitude was because of the job. She'd only done it for him. She'd do anything for him. Are you even listening? Tom yelled, his foul breath making Deb want to throw up. She nodded. What she really wanted to do was punch Tom in the face, but she'd lose her job, and then she really would be throwing everything away. Tom unzipped his flies. Being as you're here, you might as well use up the 5 minutes I've got spare. Grabbing a fistful of Deb's brown hair, he twisted it in his hand, her yelp of pain only fueling his desire for the buxom teenager. Get on with it then, he snarled, his spittle landing on her top lip. Pushing her head down, he smiled as she scrabbled to her knees. Hurry up, otherwise I'll make your right cheekbone the same colour as your left. Tom gasped as Deb took him into her mouth. He placed his hand securely on the top of her head as she worked. Don't think I didn't notice that bruise. I heard you'd pissed one of your punters off. Don't be making that a habit, eh? Deb forced herself to think of something else other than the taste and feel of this bastard. She flitted between bursting into tears of self-loathing, frustration and pure unbridled rage. She'd thought several times, actually, more like several thousand times, about walking out. Just walking out of the door, past everyone, getting on the bus and going back to Frankley. But how could she? She couldn't return to her father's, cap in hand, proving she'd failed in her quest to better herself, like she'd promised when taking his coat. She'd walked out of his house and his life 6 months ago. And worse than that, she didn't want to lose Chaz. Even though he didn't seem to like her much anymore, he was all she'd got left. Deb gagged as Tom pushed himself further down her throat. Eyes watering, she steadied herself. She had to do what Tom said. The man terrified her. She had to obey him and keep things sweet. Otherwise she might end up like that woman in the attic, the one who everyone knew was there, but no one was allowed to mention. Chapter 3. 3 days later. Grant chucked his bag on the bed in the room down the hallway from Marina and Dan's, and then walked to the window, peering through the yellowing net curtains through the grubby glass onto Bearwood High Street. 3 days was all it had to sort a place to stay before they'd left Clapham. He'd taken the lease on this 2-bed flat above the chip shop for himself, building on the idea that Marina and Dan could shoehorn their way into Linda's flat. It would be easier to get info from inside, but discovering no trace of Linda at her last known address had put a spanner in the works. He might have known his father hadn't got up-to-date information. He didn't mind sharing a place with his sister, but Dan... Grant's mouth screwed into a scowl as people queued for the chip shop below, the smell of grease clinging to every fibre of the flat. Still, what did he expect? The place was cheap, and staying in Birmingham wouldn't be a long-term thing. Hearing clattering from the small kitchen, Grant made his way down the hall, a smile on his face. None of this was his sister's fault. "Settling in okay?" "I'm looking for mugs," Marina said. "Furnished this may be, but they haven't been overly generous with their fixtures and fittings, have they?" Grant looked around the shithole which constituted a kitchen. There hadn't been a whole host of places to choose from with immediate availability, especially at the price he was willing to pay. "Where do you suppose Linda's gone?" Marina asked. "No idea," Grant shrugged. "But you can't be that surprised." Marina reached to the back of the cupboard and pulled out 2 cracked cups, one with something unsavoury stuck to the side of it. Her nose wrinkled with distaste. "She was living in the same place the last time we saw her." "Yes, but that was 4 years ago now, remember?" Grant added. It wasn't like he'd forget, even though he'd dearly loved to. "You heard what that bloke said when we went round earlier?" Marina frowned. "If what he said is correct, and she hasn't been seen for 6 months, I wonder if I can apply for a flat. Council flats go to family, don't they?" Grant shrugged. "Not sure, but I expect you'd need her consent." He raised his eyebrows. "We all know that's unlikely." Marina nodded. "Maybe I'll try again another day. You never know." Grant did. He knew. Wherever she was, Linda Matthews would be far too busy with herself to help anyone else. Marina's eyes narrowed. "Linda owes us, Grant. We've always said that. And now we've got that chance. She must be rolling in it now, courtesy of this sister." Grant nodded. Didn't he just know it? It would have been simpler with Marina in situ at Linda's to enable him to work out how to play it. But now she'd disappeared. Again. "At least we've got this place," he said, somewhat bitterly. "But this is yours. You don't want us under your feet." "It's fine," Grant lied. "You, yes. Dan, no. Stay as long as you want. Don't worry. Things will come good." Marina smiled coldly. "At least I've got something to aim for now." And Grant didn't need to know exactly everything that involved just yet. Whilst her brother still believed she had something akin to a soul, then she'd use that to her advantage. "Where's Dan?" "Out getting his bearings." Grant's teeth grated. Of course he was. Dan would be in the pub down the bottom of the road, and that's where he was going, not to the same pub. The less time he was around that loser, the better. Now Marina had settled in, and so far there was no suggestion that dickhead Dan's baggage had followed him. It was time to put the feelers out, and to do that, he needed to keep an ear to the ground. Now they were in exactly the right location, he could. And the best places to do that were boozers. Either way, they would reap some long-awaited rewards. Amelia Smith pushed her way along Broad Street, her bulky frame paying for the hike from the bus station. If she hadn't been sidetracked, she'd have been alert enough to get off at the right bloody stop, rather than having to drag herself the whole way from the terminal up here. Stupid cow that she was. It wouldn't have hurt Tom to put his hand in his pocket for once and fork out for a taxi. It was bloody freezing out here. Shivering, she pulled her thin coat around her and continued towards the Magic Bean. Amelia pulled open the door of the late-night cafe, the steamed-up front windows giving the impression that it would be warm inside. Warmer than outside, anyhow. Making her way to the counter, she glanced around the room and forced herself to smile at the sullen-looking woman eyeing her with suspicion. "Tea, please." What she really wanted was a large vodka, but by the looks of it, this place didn't serve anything like that. She glanced at the menu offering the usual, sausage and chips, egg and chips. Her stomach rumbled. She was starving, but she wasn't here to eat. She nodded at an empty table. "I'll be over there." "Take it yourself," the woman snapped, plonking the mug of tea next to the till. Charming, Amelia thought, reluctantly handing over a fiver, whilst calculating how much change she should get. If this miserable cow ripped her off, then she'd abandon all ideas of scouting and instead smash this old bitch in her fucking teeth. Pocketing the change, Amelia moved to a table near the window. She'd have preferred to sit at the back near the bubbling tea urn, where it was warmer, but that wouldn't afford her a view, and a view was what was needed. Surreptitiously glancing around, she sipped the steaming tea and pulled her cigarettes from her coat pocket. There were plenty of young girls here, and would be more as the evening progressed. She knew exactly the type required, and there were some here who fitted that bill. Having exhausted the haunts down by the bus station, the decision to come to Broad Street was a bit of a gamble. The area was well known for its nightlife, but it was expensive nightlife. Casinos, posh hotels, wine bars and upmarket clubs. Not the usual area to find girls willing to ply their wares in a place like Tom Bedworth's Aurora. But lately, there were lots of wannabes here. Youngsters trying their luck with bagging a rich, nice-looking yuppie. But would those girls be interested in the opportunity she was offering? Her eyes fell to a pair of young girls, their tight miniskirts no match for the temperature outside, but young enough to run with the beauty is pain mentality. Amelia's eyes then moved to the illuminated frontage and tempting opulence of the casino opposite. The Royal Peacock, a swish place that, or so she'd heard. It wasn't like she'd stepped through the door. She hardly passed decent enough to get into a wimpy these days. She looked down at her grubby jeans and tracksuit top underneath her thin coat. At least she wasn't working the streets anymore. Her mouth curled into a half smile, and she took another drag of her cigarette. Her promotion at the Aurora meant although she wasn't making huge amounts by running the girls and dealing with Tom's latest enterprise, at least she wasn't shagging cretins. And bringing in the youngsters was admittedly turning over a steady coin. And the younger the better, so Tom said. Personally, Amelia felt she should have received more kudos for her part in it. Bringing her 2 daughters on board at the Aurora was partly what had spawned the idea in Tom's head in the first place. But she drew the line at bringing in girls younger than 16. Her lips pursed. It wasn't right, was it? At least she'd insisted her daughters wait until they'd turned 16. People would have looked down their noses at her for allowing that, but they couldn't now her girls had come of age. No, she'd done everything a good mother should. Amelia moved her concentration back to the 2 girls chain-smoking at the opposite table and tried to picture how young they'd pass for once their slap was sandblasted off. If her estimation was correct, they'd easily pass for 15. Stubbing out a cigarette, Amelia wandered over. "Hey, girls. Interested in making some decent money?" The 2 teenagers made no effort to hide their contempt, and one of the girls raised her eyebrows theatrically, whilst the other dissolved in a fit of giggles. "Is she talking to us?" "How can you tell it's a she?" Amelia stiffened. Her immediate reaction was to punch the silly little slappers in the face, but Tom was getting twitchy, and she needed to keep her position secure. Swallowing her irritation, she smiled. "Yeah, very funny. I'm merely asking if you're interested in some work." "What sort of work?" "Oh, you know," Amelia continued, lowering her voice. "Let's just say, I can help you cash in. Pretty girls like you know what men are like. We have a good place with—" "If you're an example of how well it's going, I think we'll give it a miss." The girl laughed. The second girl stood up. "Fuck off, you old tart. Touting your brothel, or whatever it is, ain't good when you look like a fat crack whore." Amelia's anger gave way to humiliation, and before she could question her actions, she bolted from the cafe into the night. Chapter 4. "I'm seeing more and more of them every bloody day," Andrew Stoker grumbled. "It's spreading like wildfire that here is a good place to get picked up. That's not the impression we want to give." "Hookers will always be part of the scene," Seb said. "You know that. Decent classy ones, yeah, but not skanks." "Interesting you have such a detailed knowledge." Seb raised an eyebrow. "Oh, fuck off." Andrew chucked a newspaper in his brother's direction. "Security said there's hosts of them attempting entry lately. We can't have that." Seb frowned. Joking aside, that was true. It was no secret classy escorts sometimes accompanied their male companions, but a tenner ago hookers lurking about would put the customers off. They had an elite clientele at the Royal Peacock, and he wanted to keep it that way. And there was also Sam's feelings on that subject to consider. If these women are hanging around outside, then we'll get some of the boys to dissuade them. He fixed his brother with a look. I don't want this mentioned to Sam if we can help it. You know the subject's a sore point. Andrew nodded. I know Sam associates what happened to her mother as a young girl with what led to the poor cow's downfall. Don't worry. We'll do things subtly. Good. Seb leant back in his office chair. Things were going well. The Peacock's takings had remained sky-high for months. The gun deals were running like clockwork. His relationship with his parents and brothers was back to normal, and there had been no grief with territories. And if all of that wasn't good enough, his relationship with Sam had gone from strength to strength. He hadn't thought it was possible to be genuinely happy, yet he was. And it was good. More than good. There was only one problem, and it was something which had been niggling for quite some time. He'd put it to the back of his mind, hoping a solution would materialise, but nothing had, and it was time to do something about it. Seb frowned. These gun deals. That side of things is flying, as you know. The one due out tomorrow night is a huge one, one of the biggest yet. Yep, and coupled with the extra takings from the poker tournaments, we're coining it in. Andrew looked at his brother with concern. That's good, isn't it? What's the issue? The same one we've touched upon before, but now things are getting desperate. The money's fucking piling up, and with no route of offloading it at the moment, it will cause big problems. Seb forced a smile. I never thought I'd moan about having too much brass, but we need to find a way to spend without leaving a paper trail, and we're out of options at the moment. Even the second safe at the lockup is full. He'd had several meetings with the firm's bean counter Fletcher, and at present there was no way of safely laundering the cash. The only available way right now was to lose it forever and take the loss. That was not something that could be considered. Andrew looked thoughtful. You heard what Fletcher said. We can shift it soon. A few more months, that's all. Seb frowned. Fletcher was a top-quality accountant who'd successfully lost millions on paper over the years, but when all the usual routes of laundering the cash was saturated, they had to sit tight. I get that, but all that cash sitting in the safes is a beacon. If it gets found, we'd be looking at a long stretch. You've probably already thought of this, but what about the house? Andrew suggested. The house? The one you're buying with Sam? Could you not make it a cash purchase? Explain to Sam that it's temporary? Andrew raised his eyebrows. She knows the score. Seb listened with interest. He hadn't thought of that. But Andrew was wrong on one thing. He hadn't mentioned anything about the money backlogged to Sam. Andrew stood up. I'm off to check the prep for tonight's poker tournament, but think about using the house purchase. Andrew left the office, and Seb leant back in his chair. Andrew could be onto something. Funding the house would help immensely with offloading a chunk of money, while still retaining it via property. But how would he explain the reasoning behind this to Sam, without making her worry? Buying the house together via normal means was important to her, some semblance in their otherwise unusual world. But the idea was workable. Feeling somewhat relieved, Seb grinned. Another poker tournament on tonight as well. Running alternate tournaments between the Peacock and the Orchid had been Neil's idea, and it was working surprisingly well. Having the family working together towards the same aim, and with no hostility between his firm and the Reynolds, things couldn't be better. Apart from moving into that house and making Sam his wife. Not believing himself capable of loving anyone like he did her, it had been both a shock and a surprise, but one, now he'd experienced it, he wasn't letting go of. And God forbid anything that threatened that. This included keeping his nose clean. For the first time ever, there was something more than underhand dealing available. Although he'd never been straight, there was nothing to say he couldn't be as legit as a firm like his allowed. And that he intended to aim for. Sam frowned at the number displaying on her desk phone. She didn't recognise it. It wasn't one of the internal lines. Yes, she snapped. What sort of a greeting is that? Hearing Seb's distinctive gravelly voice, Sam smiled. Just the sound of the man who sent every single one of her nerve endings alight with desire made her heart soar. You're ringing me from that bloody mobile again, aren't you? She laughed. Every time it catches me out. Being constantly on guard never left her, and nor should it. She'd learnt a lot over the past few months. No longer did she shy away from the unsavoury side of things businesses like hers brought. By necessity, she'd grown into it, accepting things had to be done in ways that previously horrified her. Trust was a rare and valuable commodity, so she'd had no choice but to harden up, or drown. And drowning was not an option. Take no shit, but be fair, and having Seb by her side made it bearable. Seb made everything bearable. He was the voice of reason.